Good afternoon, everyone. Welcome to this session. It's part of the State of the Nation strand that's been happening here all day, and will continue afterwards. My name is Max Sanderson, and I'm the Battle's sort of token Guardian lefty liberal snowflake, where I help run their podcast department. Thankfully, I'm not speaking on this. There's been a slight change in programming that I just thought I'd point out on the top. Mick Brooker is no longer able to make it, but we've got a brilliant replacement who I'll introduce in full shortly. Some of you may have seen him this morning, Liam Deacon. And I'm really, really excited about this session. We've got an absolutely brilliant panel. I suppose if you've seen the kind of blurb online, the full kind of blurb, this session came out of, I think some people are calling it Lineker Gate, but that feels quite dramatic. But the stuff that happened with Gary Lineker when he sort of went on social media and criticised the government's language around their small boats policy, and he was taken off air, essentially suspended for breaching their impartiality guidelines. And for anyone who watched it, it was a very sad edition of Match of the Day, I thought, at least. I think I suppose it's not just, I'm sure there'll be a lot of stuff that comes up today about the BBC, and I think that's right, and I think that's important. But I'm also keen, as the title suggests, from BBC to GB News, that there are other organisations that I would like to sort of bring in. Obviously, GB News have, if reports are to be believed, quite the battle coming up with Ofcom, the regulator. This afternoon, I suppose I wanted to explore lots of different things. I heard a hiss back there, which I quite liked. Lots of different things. I suppose one of them, which I think is really important, is like, what do we mean by impartiality? Both in terms of, as an ideal, but also, in practice, and how did those two things kind of rub up against each other? I really want to look at how this kind of interpretation of impartiality has changed over time. As new forms of media come in, new companies come in, I want to kind of explore that. Also, I want to explore, what impartiality looks like, if it even exists anywhere else in the world. And I suppose, in light of the Gary Lineker stuff, something I felt was this tension that exists as well between sort of quote-unquote impartiality and free speech. Gary Lineker didn't go on a BBC platform to say this. He's not a BBC political reporter. He, presents a football show. And he went on his personal social media and he said this stuff. And, how does that sort of this idea of him, he breached their impartiality guidelines, how does that rub up against, his right to say what he wants? Lots to cover. I'm sure you'll all have lots of ideas. And, having been here for at least a day, some of you 2 days, you'll know that this is very much a kind of public conversation. So I'm going to introduce my panel shortly in the order that they'll be speaking, and then we'll come straight out to you. We'll get lots of questions and points, and hopefully we can do that a couple of times, go back and forth. So first up, on my left, will be Ian McWhirter. He is a former BBC lifer. He worked there for 27 years, and he is now a columnist for The Times and The Spectator. After him, we'll have Baroness Tina Stell, who also spent 9 years, sorry camera guys, who also spent 9 years at the BBC before joining the House of Lords as a Conservative peer. And she now chairs their Communications and Digital Select Committee, but she is here speaking in a personal capacity. Like I said, unfortunately, Mick Brooker can't be here today. I keep saying Brooker, his name's Booker, can't be here today. He sends his apologies. But in his place, we've got the brilliant Liam Deacon. He was part of the launch team for GB News and also did the press desk for the Brexit Party. And before that, he was a tabloid reporter. And then last but certainly not least, giving us a view from across the pond will be Helen Searles. She is the Chief Operating Officer at Feature Story News, which is an international broadcast news agency. So I'm sure you're all familiar with the usual format. Speakers will be given an introductory pitch. Will allow up to 6 minutes. I'll let them know when they've got 1 minute left. And then we will immediately open up to you and I'm looking forward to hearing all your questions and points. I've realised I forgot to ask you all to welcome our speakers, so please do that now. So first up, Ian.
Thank you, Max. As you said, I was I was BBC employee, man and boy. So what can I say about impartiality? A much maligned concept, not least by post-structuralists who regard it like objectivity and balance as being a fiction. And I did too when I joined the BBC. I mean, I was very left-wing. I was very hostile, opposed to both sidesism, the idea that all you could do in journalism, in broadcasting, was to have one side and then the other, and then say what happens next remains to be seen, which is the standard payoff line from BBC News correspondents. But once you're in there for any length of time, well, I mean, I learned two things. First of all, that everybody in the BBC was broadly speaking on the same political platform or wing as I was. I mean, they're broadly liberal left on all the key issues about immigration, about race, European integration, and what have you, and everybody hated the Tories, of course. And, you know, this was just the culture of the BBC. It was very, very liberal left. Very few conservatives were, in my experience, employed there. The centre of gravity was profoundly to the liberal left. But at the same time, people did take impartiality incredibly seriously. In fact, I almost say there was a kind of cult of impartiality in the BBC, whatever you think of that concept. Very quickly, you realise why. I mean, you know, you couldn't just come in and start, you know, spouting workers' press on the state broadcaster. It has to reflect, as best it can, the political demography of the country that pays for the license fee that is there for, that it's there for. And this is uniquely the case in the UK. There's no other broadcasting organisation quite like it, and that imposes very strict, almost monastic obligations on the people who work for it. So, I mean, when I was working there, at any rate, you know, Gary Lineker's comments would have been inconceivable that someone as prominent as he is, so identified with the BBC brand, would say effectively that the Home Secretary was talking like a Nazi. I think they would have been more objective. I hope they would have been more objective about the situation in Gaza and would not have instantly taken you know, the Hamas spin that these Israeli airstrikes were the cause of that disaster in the Abu Abel hospital. You know, that's a debatable issue. But, you know, it was, as I say, taken very, very seriously. I mean, not just in news and current affairs and political broadcasting, where I worked as a political presenter, and then obviously you had to have everything strictly balanced by stopwatch and strictly related to what political parties' representation was in elections, and that was all to the good. But it spread across to in current affairs broadcasting as well, and that's the thing also. Even, I mean, if you take the news quiz now, which kind of tends to be sort of a kind of left-wing agitprop, I think when I was working there in the 90s, that would have been seen as just really bad form. It was very naff. You know, it was not seen as the done thing to expose your political opinions on air or to have them reflected in the programs you might be producing. You know, it wasn't as simple as that. And things have obviously changed, and I'm trying to work out exactly where that change took place, when impartiality and the BBC's concept of it ceased properly to apply. I think it's sometime around in the mid-noughties. It's partly because of the influence of social media. People in the BBC are obsessed with social media, as most journalists are. And in social media, you know, it's one thing or the other. There's no question of balance or impartiality there. You know, you have to follow the line. Also, the BBC did, for very understandable reasons, try to diversify its employee base. It drafted in people from ethnic and political minorities, and these were very often people who are activists and did not see the idea of impartiality as in any way sensible. So you had the first critical moment for the BBC was climate change, when it decided around about 2014-15 that in future there would not be two sides to climate change. There's one side, and you stick to that. You stick to the doctrine, the the view of climate change taken by the IPCC, and you do not criticize even the way in which progress to net zero is being applied. I think this is a very unfortunate development. You may remember that it was Nigel Lawson's appearances on the Today programme which created this row and led to the BBC saying quite openly that no longer would it regard this as something which could be debated in any way. Now, I think that was a huge disservice to environmentalism and to the progress to net zero, because what it meant was that all sorts of policies related to net zero are no longer criticised. After that, you had Brexit, which again, people at the BBC said, well, there's only one side there, isn't it? It's obvious, you know, and Brexit is ridiculous. You can't, you know, Emily Maitlis started saying that you can't get economists to support Brexit, therefore the BBC should only have one line and it should criticise it. And then, of course, came Trump and Stonewall and LGBT, which again meant there was only one-sidism. So we're in this situation. Tim Davie has now said, apparently, that anybody in the BBC can express their own political opinions, and Gary Lineker is now quite free to express his opinions on the situation in Iraq, in Israel, or Iraq indeed, or in terms of his views about what Suella Braverman has to say about these kinds of situations. But I think this is they've made a big mistake here, because it was possible to defend impartiality, imprecise and vague as it was. It's not possible to now say that everyone in the BBC can express their views, because of course they can't. I would only believe that that was the case when I saw Clive Murray coming on and saying that Graham Linehan is in fact being hard done by.
Thank you very much, Ian. Really important insight into, I suppose, the inner workings of the BBC and also how it's possibly changed over time. Tina.
Thank you, Max. So I believe in the principle of due impartiality, and I want to retain it for as long as we believe that public service broadcasting, and especially the BBC as our national broadcaster, should exist as a unifying force and providing some social glue. Because if that is what we want from a national broadcaster and the PSBs, then impartiality is an essential element of that. So I would make that as my simple case for impartiality. The bad news, though, is that in the eyes of some audiences, the PSBs and the BBC in particular are not as impartial as they need to be. And that's possibly because impartiality in the eyes of the public isn't just about being non-partisan. It's also mixed up with how much they trust the BBC as an institution and their sense of whether it's sufficiently accountable to all. And just as a sidebar on Gary Lineker, my view was Gary Lineker's issue was not about his freedom of speech, it was about his lack of accountability to all licence fee payers. Now, in my remarks, I'm sort of stressing the BBC because, as I say, they're the national broadcaster, which we all have to pay for, and they have more responsibility, but they're not alone either in their weaknesses or indeed in terms of their obligations to Ofcom under the law. But focusing on the BBC, contrary to what some at the corporation seem to believe, they are the cause of their own problem. It is not anyone else's fault. As our national broadcaster, the BBC's failure to reflect seriously and with respect the perspective of some audiences on difficult topics like immigration, climate change, welfare benefits, etc., is pushing some people away. And if I can sum it up, I think what frustrates some audiences who may not subscribe to the accepted or acceptable view on difficult or contentious issues, I'm saying acceptable in quotes, by the way, is the sense that they need to be educated when they really want what they really want is to be listened to and their perspective to be treated seriously. Now, you could say the same thing as what I've just said about some political parties too. This is an affliction which is suffered across a range of different types of people, politicians included, and you know, this when Brexit happened, as Ian has already said, there was a lot of people who were surprised by that. But this is the important bit when it comes to broadcasting, and which is new and needs to be taken seriously. Technology and new arrivals means that people now have more choice and they can find what they want that they might not be getting from the national broadcasters elsewhere. And that is the failing on the part of the BBC, together also with ITV and Sky, and has caused audience demand for something else which new arrivals like GB News can supply. Now, I think more choice is a good thing, and overall the effect of more choice has been positive. I should just add that, personally, I don't like it when some of GB News' presenters have become sort of nasty and sought to justify that in the name of free speech. But in any case, I'm not suggesting that the BBC or Sky should become like GB News for them to survive. What I'm saying is that GB News is filling a gap in the market that the BBC and ITV and Sky have created. And I want the BBC to recognise that unless it serves all audiences properly, their impartiality and trust scores are going to keep falling. And that will mean that it can't be a unifying force for good. And I believe that social glue from a national broadcaster is an important element for a fractured society. And without it, the justification for the BBC to retain its status and public funding is going to be very hard for them to make. Just a couple of things to add. I don't think it's good enough for the BBC to argue that it's the most trusted or the most impartial, whilst that may be true. The point is that they don't score highly with all sections of the population, and their performance is mixed amongst different demographic groups, and that's going to keep continuing until they respond to that. And as to the most recent events in terms of the use of language around Israel and Gaza, clearly the historic Middle East conflict has required the BBC and broadcasters not to take sides. But when it comes to, I think, this current situation, it's the BBC's unwillingness to take a side on language that has been causing it so many problems. And I think that the same kind of frustration people are feeling with the BBC right now is the same as what they feel at the police and what's informing some of the police operational decisions. Because public institutions like the BBC are meant to represent our best selves, so we want them to act in ways that represent our value of standing up for what's right. And I think relying on independence, which is another thing which is important to the BBC and to its continuation, and it's the flip side of impartiality, as the reason for not doing what we expect isn't adequate, because its institutions, we want these institutions to be independent from politics, but we don't want them to be independent from us.
Thank you very much, Tina. I realise we didn't give a round of applause to Ian either, so I'm going to continue my round of applause. Please join me. Liam.
Hi. I found out that I was speaking on this about an hour and 10 minutes before it kicked off, so do apologise. I was enjoying a Chinese meal just over the road. So I'm absolutely stuffed. I have plenty to say on this topic, but apologies if it's not very structured. So I was one of the founding producers at GB News, an incredibly chaotic and difficult time. But I think all of us, there's some other people in the audience today that were part of the team with me. I think what we did was quite brave. Everyone hated us. Everyone wanted us to fail. So I'm glad we did it. I'm not a spokesman for GB News. I certainly don't defend some of the things that have been said on it recently. Then again, there's also been some rather gross things said on the BBC about refusal to call terrorists. But I'm not a spokesperson for GB News. But the points I want to make are around impartiality. So we have this idea in the UK that broadcasters, radio and television, terrestrial things, are going to be impartial, but newspapers can be as bombastic and campaigning and as interesting as they want to be. It's absurd. Because in today's environment, every single newspaper I've worked at also produces video content, okay? And every single TV station also produces written content. And for some reason, we have this arbitrary distinction where the written can be interesting and the broadcast, and it's not even just the broadcast, it's just the analog broadcast. If you broadcast digitally, you can be as free to speak as you want. It's just absurd. And I think this is a theme I'm going to come back to, that impartiality may have worked in the past. People might have liked it. But today it's a myth, and the sort of availability of information and media today is meaning that it's not only becoming absurd, I think it's actually becoming quite harmful. We just heard the previous speaker made a very good argument, and I think tried very hard to defend impartiality as a social glue that sort of binds the UK together. And actually, I disagree with that really strongly. I think that the idea that the BBC is perfectly impartial on everything from sort of coronavirus to astrophysics to politics to sex to gender, and they know exactly where the middle ground in all these issues, is absurd, and it's eroding trust in our media generally, and it's eroding trust in some very talented but not impartial journalists. So, I mean, there were some classic examples during the BLM protest where there was a street on fire, and there was a journalist in front of it going, peaceful protest, and people could just see, they could Google this, and they could look at the riots in real time. And that's where the internet sort of has this effect. We can see alternative sources. We can go to the primary source ourselves, and we can see that things are more complicated. And the line that's been delivered to me in this sort of stoic way down the camera by a BBC man in a nice suit is actually not the whole truth. It's sort of the sanitized truth that they want us to follow. And that's eroding trust in all of us journalists. I think what's happened with Emily Maitlis, and Lewis Goodall is one of my favourite examples, because when I was the head of press at the Brexit Party, I think he was a fine and talented journalist who used to phone me up and ask me really searching questions about the sort of 4 million core voters that UKIP had and that were coming over to the Brexit Party, and he was interested in why we just won a national election, and I introduced him to our voters, and he was a bloody good journalist. But he had a Twitter account as well. And everyone could see that he sort of was a bit Laboury. Fine, I have no problem with that, because the journalism that he was doing was great. But when he stood there in front of a camera and pretended to be impartial, everyone that had been online and on Twitter knew it was a lie. Okay, and what would have been much better if he was able to be honest and be able to say, I'm a bit lefty, I'm a bit Labour, but I'm here to report. And honesty breeds trust, especially in an era when there's so many sources of information are available. And I think that's where the BBC is tripping itself over, and where it's losing out to more interesting and more honest media organisations online. GB News is a really interesting example, because I think if Ofcom hadn't... GB News 5-6 years ago would be inconceivable. Ofcom, people just assumed that Ofcom guidelines wouldn't allow it, and then talk radio became a thing. In about 2018, it started picking up a big viewership and became really, really passing. You had Julie Hartley-Brewer, followed by... the whole morning was right-wing, and it was utterly... And I remember people wouldn't have invested in GB News if Talk Radio hadn't already sort of laid down the foreground there and done the work and proved that you could be a right-wing media organisation. And those 4 million people that I spoke about earlier that were utterly disaffected with the BBC, that voted UKIP, that voted Brexit Party, would have just fully gone online. They would have fallen completely outside of the purview of Ofcom if Ofcom hadn't said, OK, we'll allow GB News to exist. They can dance the dance and pretend to be impartial and book one token person a day, and we'll allow them to be on the telly. And so I think that's why Ofcom had to do it, because they would have just lost these people to online groups. But it's absurd. The dance that we all danced at GB News pretending to be this. I'm not a spokesperson for GB News, by the way. And if a spokesperson for GB News was here right now, they'd be saying, we respect Ofcom rules, because they would have to say that. But I've left now, and I can be a little bit honest, and I can say that it was quite absurd, the situation we were in, where we were speaking to an audience, we knew who our core audience were, and we were having to... Having said all of that, I do also think it's really important that people are exposed to different points of view, and that we challenge people and we prick people's bubbles. And the way to do that, I think, is to breed confidence in the... platforms and media outlets that we do have, and encourage people to shop around a little bit and get outside of their bubble. But if we're going to force them to do it in a way where they're forced to pay a license fee and forced to listen to a guy lying on television to them every day, it's not going to work. So that's where I'm at. And actually, I'll take one more quick point. It became quite dangerous, actually, the idea of impartiality during the pandemic, because then you had English literature grads making decisions about what eminent scientists could and could not speak on the news about an incredibly multidisciplinary scientific issue, and they were deciding where the middle ground was and who, and quite often in those very complex, quickly moving, emerging scientific situations, the elements of truth can lie on both sides. And what the BBC ended up doing was parroting the government position and censoring valid and sometimes true scientific opinions. So that's what I mean about the sort of the incredible arrogance that it takes to think that you can be impartial on every single point of view in the 21st century. And I think usually it's just annoying, but during COVID it became dangerous.
Thank you, Liam. And thank you for forfeiting your Kung Po chicken to be here. Last and certainly not least, Helen, who's going to give us a view from America, hopefully give the BBC a bit of a break for 6 minutes, and then I'm sure we'll come back to bashing them. Helen.
Thanks. Yeah, I'm coming from America. I've lived there for 25 years. So honestly, I really haven't even watched the BBC or ever watched GB News. So I'm really very impartial on some of that kind of thing. But I think there is a lesson to be learned from the US. In the US, things are different. We do have a regulator for broadcasters, like Ofcom, but it is the FCC. But the rules are quite different, and I think they raise some interesting differences. Between 1948 and 1987, the FCC did have a fairness doctrine, which meant that you had to give equal time to each side, you had to give the right of reply. There were all sorts of rules regulating how you could have fairness on television. The debate about the doctrine being abandoned, I think, is very interesting because it was always hated by broadcasters because it was seen as taking control of their editorial time. It was seen as, compelled speech, that you were having to air stuff that you didn't like. So it was always hated by them. But actually, the regulators decided to abandon the fairness doctrine in the public interest. They said it was in the public interest because it was a violation of free speech to impose impartiality onto the media. And the reason for this was that because when it was being abandoned, it was a result of the proliferation of the media in the US. So, for example, it was abandoned in '87, but the PBS news organization began in 1970, NPR began in 1970, CNN began in the 1980s as a 24-hour news channel, and gradually you could see the proliferation of different medias. And in a marketplace where there were lots and lots of different different broadcasters, it was deemed that it made no sense to say that everybody had to be impartial. And so they began to treat, they got rid of it as a doctrine. And literally, the moment it was got rid of, that was the beginning of conservative talk radio, happened in the same year. And so you could see that then you had a proliferation of much more opinionated media, which I think is interesting. And I think it's a much better model, which I will explain in a minute. Because I think it allows for the airing in public of lots of different ideas. I think there is a role for impartiality. I think some broadcasters can make that their thing. Certainly for publicly funded broadcasters, I think it's important that there is a impartiality. So NPR, PBS, try to be impartial. They are not always. But for others, it really is much more of a messy business. The American media gets a lot of stick, but it's a much more messy business. And as the viewer is trusted to make decisions on what they're hearing. And so when, election night, you're trying to find out what's going on, you have to channel hop. But we live in an age where we have remote controls, and so you can switch around. So that's the view from the US, and I think it's an interesting one. Having said that, I think there is actually a problem that is outside the regulation of this for news broadcasters. And I think the problem that we face, which I think Ian talked about a little bit, is that in the more recent period, although I would date it back further, we now face a kind of class of journalists who I would call kind of crusading journalism, which I think are bringing themselves into the story, and I think that's a problem. I think in America, if you look at Fox, a much maligned organization, if you look at Fox, it used to be that you would always have, Fox opinion shows, which was a lot. It's a 24-hour news, Fox News Channel is 24 hours, lots and lots of opinion. But the news was very, very separate. So someone like Chris Wallace, I don't don't know if anyone knows him, very highly respected journalist in America, and the news was always much more impartial, and the news programs were outside of that kind of opinion thing. Now I think you have campaigning journalists. I think it began, I would say, probably in the 90s, but I think it really began around foreign reporting, when journalists were out reporting on wars, and there was a sort of way of reporting wars around the idea of good and evil. I think that's a very important concept that gets introduced into for journalists, where journalists basically take sides, and they see, whoever it is, Serbia becomes the big enemy or whoever, and they get involved in campaigning and portraying things in such a way that they portray one side in a different way than the other. What I think's then happened is in the current century, the way that domestic politics is looked at is also around that whole notion of good and evil. And once you had Trump or Brexit, then that is the great evil. And so I think journalists then said, well, if he's the evil person, or Brexit is evil, then of course I shouldn't be neutral. I should be actually putting forward an opinion which is campaigning and really puts it in the best light. So I think there is it's campaigning journalism that I think is the problem, rather than impartiality. We have a set of rules where I work. You cannot use your social media. If you're doing news, you do not tweet. You don't tweet news. We do actually try to keep our journalists very, very impartial. They may go on opinion shows, or I may come and speak here, and I speak in a personal capacity, but I think that is something different. Obviously, the consequence is very much what we saw in Gaza. I'm not going to repeat that, but I think there is a problem of campaigning journalism where you literally do take a side, and I think that's the change that's taken place.
Thank you, Helen. Really important view for what feels like a very British problem. Right, questions. We've got about 40 minutes.
Okay, I don't think there's a problem. I don't think there's a problem with impartiality. I think what Liam was saying was that the BBC took a view on COVID lockdowns, and it did, and therefore that's not impartial. But I think when, as one of the speakers has said, when the public broadcaster is paid for by the community, by the nation, then I think that the broadcaster should try and reflect that national view. So I think it went wrong on Brexit. I think the BBC, for example, when Rishi Sunak pushed back the deadlines for petrol cars and heat pumps, the first line of the BBC News was, environmental groups have reacted angrily to the news. It should have just been Rishi Sunak pushed the deadline back. So I think the BBC, it surprises me that Tim Davie has been in the job for over a year, and he's pledged to crack down, and yet every time the news comes on, we're just kind of treated to wokeism. So I don't know what he's actually doing. And Gary Lineker, he talks about Suella Braverman talking in the language of the Nazis. He didn't tweet at all about people going and murdering 1,400 Jews. So go figure.
Thank you very much. There was a point. There's someone with a book in their hand. Yeah, I can see the book.
Well, I thought what Liam had to say was very refreshing when he calls out the fig leaf of impartiality for the disingenuous, you know what I mean, for being disingenuous. But I think he falls into a trap of relativism. You probably don't want to sound like a postmodernist, but you did, because you were getting to the point of saying all reporting is opinion, and let's just say that it is and get on with it. But on the other hand, the defence for impartiality, as we've heard it so far, seems to be to do with issues of representation. It's wrong for the BBC not to represent the breadth and width of the nation, which is true. It is wrong, and that has been the case. But that's surely a different, well, to me, that's not really the core issue of impartiality. Impartiality is not a concept that, in my mind, should be audience-led and who's getting their 15 minutes of fame. It's about accountability to truth, accountability to verifiable facts, which then become the predicate for the battle of ideas to commence. And believe it or not, people can be trained. Journalists can be trained to make their professional persona part of this truth as a work in progress. So let's have impartiality in that sense. Let's not fall into the relativist trap, nor for that matter think that it's just audience-led and whose identity is getting represented on the national broadcaster.
I want to come back to the last speaker, no, not the last but one, Liam. I wasn't quite convinced about your suggestion for how we would break people's echo chambers. Whether you would expand on that. If the BBC does anything, it is at least obliged to put 2 points of view, even if it sometimes slants it in ways. You still have to hear another point of view. And my other point to anyone on the panel was, picking up on Helen's phrase, crusading journalism. Isn't that just monumental arrogance? Is 3 years media studies degree really proper training for thinking that you know all the answers to all the problems in the world?
Good question.
Isn't impartiality a good corrective to arrogance and a good way of instilling just a little bit of humility?
Behind
I think many here will welcome the addition of GB News. I certainly do, although it's a shame that you lost Mark Stein. And increasingly, it does look like a sort of media branch of the Conservative Central Office. I think they employ about 5 to 10% of the parliamentary party at the moment, which is quite interesting. But fine, because we don't get many of those views expressed on the BBC. But I just wondered, to what extent can GB News survive the boycotts by woke media agencies?
Yeah, hi. I'd like to hear the panel try and tease out the difference between impartiality on contested issues and accuracy, where there are matters of fact. Because it seems to me that what's happened is everything now has become a contested matter, and that's how we end up with the BBC creating educational material that tells children there are more than 100 genders. And surely we kind of know the answer to how many sexes there are. So I've lost trust in many of the media because they treat basic matters of fact as if they require representation from a range of views. How do we tease those two types of reporting apart?
Thank you, really important. Right, so we'll come back to the panel and then we'll come back out. Liam, do you want to go first? There's a few directed to you, including a charge of being a relativist.
I know. No, I think it's really important that you raise that, and thank you. Just to come back on this point about there being 100 genders, and also to address the relativist point, we live in a pluralist society, and one man's fact is another man's hate crime. But there is a right and there is a wrong, and there are facts, okay? But the fact that you just said there are two genders, two sexes. Other people find that very offensive, okay, and get incredibly hurt by that, and it challenges their sense. I know, but I mean, so what? So what? But that's the society we live in, okay? We're an entirely pluralistic society. The relativism point is incredibly important, and I've been challenged by this online as well, and I've made this point in articles. And it is a difficult point for me to answer, I accept that. But actually what I am saying is I want more people to make value judgments. I want more people to express their personality in our media. But we cannot have a situation where the state or Ofcom or even one very, very clever editor somewhere decides what the facts are on everything, because they will be wrong about some things. We need that pluralism. And you might not like some of it, but it's going to exist. So, and I have my views about, I believe in a right and a wrong. I'm certainly not a relativist. But it's very important that I don't get stuck in that trap. But it's just about who you get to define truth and who you get to define what is right and wrong. Because I think when you start picking one single person to do that, that's even more dangerous than the sort of risk that I do accept that I start welcoming relativism.
Ian, there was lots of stuff in there about the kind of inner workings of the BBC, I suppose. I'll just work across the...
Well, yeah, I mean, I think it's quite interesting that people are criticising the BBC principally when it departs from impartiality rather than observing it. I mean, over, for example, Israel and its willingness to recycle, the propaganda, if you like, of Hamas officials without criticising them. People rightly think that's a breach of its requirements for impartiality. On gender as well, I mean, I didn't mention this, but the BBC became infatuated with Stonewall, LGBT. It has an LGBT correspondent.
Used to.
Does it used to? Well,
They sacked him, didn't they?
Well, I don't know, but they decided to have, in their wisdom, an LGBT correspondent. I mean, you couldn't imagine a heterosexual correspondent. And it certainly has, until very recently, it regarded transgenderism as being something like climate change that you don't discuss. There's only one side on this, and that is that you accept that, there are 99 genders and that, sex is an illusion and all the rest of it. And also on Brexit, as other people have mentioned there, that the BBC tended, I think, quite clearly to skew towards a kind of anti-Brexit position in the belief, because many journalists in the BBC did regard Brexit as a catastrophe, as a huge mistake, as unsustainable economically, and therefore they thought that, both sidism, as Emily Maitlis would have put it, is wrong, and therefore they should express that. And that is kind of the problem you get into when you start saying that, there's this fig leaf of impartiality, we should accept that truth is real and we should search for truth. I mean, there are many truths, and there are also many different political opinions, which are perfectly valid. And as I said, if you have a state broadcaster, the only way it can proceed is if it reflects the political demography of the country as best as it can, because otherwise there's no point in having public sector broadcasting. I mean, it may be that it is an anachronism in the streaming age. Maybe we should just abandon it, but as long as you have it, it has to be based on impartiality to some extent.
Helen, there was a question about kind of impartiality and objectivity. I don't know if you, come back to whatever you want, but I thought that was quite interesting.
Yeah, I mean, I think that what Liam is describing is actually campaigning journalism, because I really think you can. I mean, journalists are trained, and whatever we may think of journalism school, there are ways to report stories in order to reflect a balanced view, and that's what journalists are meant to do. It's what editors do. They read scripts to make sure that the script is balanced and that you're reporting both sides. Lots of people said, BBC won't call Hamas terrorists. I mean, Reuters don't call Hamas terrorists. That actually is a basic principle, that you don't name things yourself as a journalist, you attribute them. And so you say the British government, or whoever it is, the American government, say this is a terrorist organisation. Other people say something else. And I think that there are rules that you have to abide by as a journalist. And I would say most would have a kind of code of conduct, which means that you can report things in an objective way. You take yourself out of the story. One of the things I really disliked about the BBC, at the same time that John Simpson was lecturing us all about the basic rules of journalism and Hamas and whether they're terrorists or not, the BBC website was leading on a very brave journalist who was in Gaza and was being evacuated to the south. Great kind of human interest story, but he talked about what his family thought about it, how he felt. I mean, to me, that's a correspondence diary. It's not a news piece. And I think that and they've now turned him into a kind of, correspondent who's sort of on the ground in Gaza, and they've ruined him as a reporter, because, you'd like to send him to say, go and look at the bomb site. Just tell us how big is it? 6 foot, 20 foot, but he's now already identified as one side of the story. So that's I think it is possible for journalists to find a truth, but you have to do it in a way that you take yourself out of the story, you reflect what other people are saying, not what you think. And that's how, a whole bunch of left-wing BBC journalists, all journalists are lefties. I don't know any conservative journalists. So, but, they all manage to be able to abide by the rules in order to tell a story. And that's When they do it, that's what we want, because then you can actually learn something. When they don't do it, you're just going to get their opinion. And I agree with the guy who's been to City University for, their MAs are not necessarily experts on these things. So that, I think you can be objective.
Thanks, Helen. If you want right-wing journalists, you should come to The Guardian. There's loads of them there. Yeah. Tina.
I agree with Helen about personality-led journalism, and I think one of the important aspects of the BBC that it is now falling into is being more personality-led in the way in which it's presenting news or reporting news. And I take very much on board what Liam was saying and arguing, but I think, I do believe that for a national broadcaster that we are all paid for, there are certain requirements and expectations that we rightly have of that we may not necessarily apply to other broadcasters, even though there may be a legal requirement on all of them, which is consistent. And I think that impartiality doesn't have to be boring either. It's it would be. It would be a disservice to audiences if seeking to provide impartial news coverage that the result was, very boring and dull information. I genuinely think that what people are looking for from an organisation like the BBC, and it will be different to what they look for from a channel like GB News. And I think it's perfectly okay in today's world, where technology allows so much choice, for people to want and expect different things from different kind of news outlets. I don't think that's anything other than good, actually. But I think what the BBC needs to be, more than anybody else, is accountable to everyone, and that's where it is failing, because I'm not quite sure I agree with the gentleman who said that impartiality shouldn't be audience-led. It's quite true that we shouldn't expect in every story, every facet to be represented. But I think in the round, what everybody has a right to expect is that their perspective, if it's a reasonable one, and is taken seriously and is treated respectfully. And that's what people feel, I think, too often now, that they're not seeing or hearing when they tune into the BBC.
Thank you.
Can I just pick up on one other question?
Go on. Yeah,
Sorry,
very quickly.
Yeah. Firstly, I don't disagree with what you guys have just described as good quality journalism, bringing in different perspectives. I'm not eschewing that for a moment, and I think people will choose that in a genuinely free market. Al Jazeera, all these other channels that bring in different perspectives, and people choose it all across the Arab world. The point that we didn't address was the boycott against GB News. I think this is really important because the boycott applies to the TV channel, right? And the TV channel is a small part of the business model. Most of the viewers on GB News are online, and I think the longer that arrogant campaigning big companies pursue this boycott, it will force GB News to give up on Ofcom and give up on their mainstream television channel and just double down on the online offering, where they get more sort of advertising revenue. So I think BMW and all these companies pursuing an advertising boycott against GB News should be very cautious, because it's probably going to backfire, and they will just give up on their Ofcom license and go online, because the advertising boycott is working. They're not making the money they thought they would be.
Thanks, Liam. All right, if we kind of bring the mic...
I would say the BBC has a responsibility to report that as a story, because that's bad for the corporates that are doing that, and that should be something that everybody has a right to be made aware of through their national broadcaster.
Yeah. Right, so the lady in the blue here, if you could stand up for the TV cameras if you can. If we could keep them really short, I'm going to start showing you, waving my 1 minute left sign. It's very aggressive, 1 minute left. It's all caps lock.
My question's kind of been answered already, but that was, how can we justify the licence fee when we not only got people like GB News appearing, but there are online television stations that can operate internationally, and there's also a lot of online media. I write for one of them, and I often just pull apart BBC written work where they don't ever give you their links, and I always rebut them. and I give you links to all of the areas where you can find the actual government edict and what it says, which is not always what the BBC reports. And it's kind of incredible that they get away with what is propaganda, nothing more than that.
Yeah, no, thank you very much. My question is, so a lot of when people think about impartiality, they think about ideas like balance across the schedule or even prominence of certain content in people's, I guess it used to be more of a terrestrial television schedule, and now, of course, that's social media feeds. And social media feeds are entirely algorithm-driven. It's based on what you're already consuming and looking at. So by definition, for most people, that is not or Spotify. Like if I pull up Spotify on a topic, they're not giving any prominence to any particular outlet with any with any basis other than what I've previously looked at or consumed. So I guess one question I have is, do you believe that this is a realm of freedom of choice? In other words, like people are getting what they're getting, they're looking at this, the algorithm's giving them what they want. It's that's one way of saying it. Another way of saying it is, well, this is not providing a balanced view. People will get a radically one-sided perspective from news algorithms that would be incompatible with any idea of impartiality or prominence.
Yeah, thanks. One of the issues with impartiality is not so much accuracy of facts, obviously that is important, but is what does get reported and what doesn't. What is absent? It's the absence of things. A couple of observations I had, having come to Britain 30 years ago from Australia, was how little was reported about the EU, and then the referendum came, and people would, I knew people who were very shouty on either direction. You asked them a question, do you know anything that goes on there? No. It was almost as if it was censored from the news. There was so little, and you say, does really nothing happen, whether either on a new policy or a new law or a directive, or a scandal, a sex scandal or a corruption scandal? Was nothing ever happening, really? The other thing that I found a little odd is this ludicrous thing they've got with this fact checker, Mariana's fact checker, right? And you know, where she goes into these conspiracy theories, and right under her nose is a BBC journalist getting a story from the chief executive of HSBC about Nigel Farage's bank accounts. Does Mariana report about that? Similarly, Carol Cadwallader got a bath in a thing with, there's another conspiracy theory she had about Aaron Banks. Does she report about that? And you get crickets. And I've come to the conclusion that the BBC is just a form of entertainment. That it's not really a serious organisation. I pay my licence fees because I'm not naturally law-abiding, but if there was a way to avoid it, I would. I don't watch it.
A few people have talked about kind of blurred lines between propaganda and journalism, and I was just wondering if anyone on the panel could comment on GB News hiring Boris Johnson as a presenter.
Slightly tangential, but the role of newspapers in allowing a breadth of ideas to be disseminated was briefly touched on by Liam. I'm interested in the panel's view on how the collapse of the traditional broadsheet and even the tabloids has affected the quality of broadcast news. Has it created the impartiality void?
Lovely, nice and succinct. Right, we'll come back to the panel. If we could do, we'll start with you, Tina, and work our way across here. If you could do a minute and a half responding
Gosh,
to whatever you'd like.
all of that.
Yeah, good luck.
Gosh, I don't know. I thought the point that the gentleman made about impartiality also being around what gets excluded as well as what gets reported is a really important point that we mustn't forget, actually. And there's those, who is, what is driving the editorial choices, as far as what's of interest. So, I'm trying to think of something to say which is interesting in response to that beyond, I thought that was a really good point and one to take on board, but I don't know whether any of the journalists on the panel might want to offer a reason as to how these choices do get made. And I think I'll just respond on the appointment of Boris Johnson to GB News. Well, I think that's clearly quite a coup for GB News, and and we'll sort of see what happens as a result of that.
Helen?
Yeah, I mean, I thought the story selection question was good. Just in our own newsroom, we were reporting on the G20. Biden went to India to report, to take part in the G20. And one of the conservative networks, actually, we're trying to work out what stories we're going to do and everything. And our journalists are there in India. And he writes me, he says, yeah, we'll take coverage, but we're only interested if Biden stumbles. And that was it, like the whole of the G20, and they didn't have their own journalists there, they were using our agency, so they were only interested in that. So I think story selection is quite interesting. But I think you can see it on the other side. I mean, one of the big gripes of Republicans in America is that the fact that the sort of mainstream media did not cover Hunter Biden's laptop, which really probably wasn't a huge important, but if they'd have actually covered it at the time and just reported on it, it would have been a different story. And I think that kind of not reporting of stories creates huge resentments, and it also creates bad journalism. So when Trump was elected, I think similarly to when Brexit happened here, newsrooms around the US were gobsmacked because they never went to the flyover states. They never, ever went and talked to anybody. They didn't think that was a very interesting story. And so, here suddenly someone was elected and it was a big surprise. So I think the non-reporting of stories is very important.
Thank you. So if we could, maybe pick one thing to respond to, please, and then we can go back out. Ian.
Well, actually, I was interested about your remarks about newspapers, because I think there has been a significant change there. I mean, you have to remember that, newspapers were where journalism began, clearly, and they always were originally very opinionated, particularly in America. And impartiality, objectivity, and balance, two-sidedism, very recent phenomenon. And it really only came along with broadcasting, because broadcasters were obliged to observe these standards. And you can see it in the trajectory of the New York Times. I mean, it used to be called the Grey Lady, didn't it? Because it was so one side and the other side, and it was so objective and rather boring. Now it's ultra woke. Every front page story is an opinion piece. It doesn't do stories, it doesn't do news stories really anymore. And that's partly... Well, it's partly because of the breakdown of, the idea of impartiality in broadcasting, but it's also commercially driven. And newspapers have always been commercially driven. And it's commercially driven because, as they will admit themselves, it was Donald Trump who saved the New York Times. It was going down the toilet until Trump came along, and then it saw an opportunity, and it started becoming the anti-Trump newspaper, and its sales soared, and its online subscriptions absolutely soared. And it's now, one of the most successful surviving newspapers. Others are not in such a good condition. And that's another thing to remember about journalism. It's very crude. When people say, how do you select stories? Remember, it's a story. And originally, it was just a story. Newspaper editorial content was usually just there to get people to read the adverts. And a story was something that would get people to read. It was as simple and as crude as that. That's why the journalists always said, the old school, dog bites man is not a story. Man bites dog is a story. So it's something that grabs people's attention. I mean, I know that's an unfortunate way of putting it, but that's what journalism originally was. And it still is, to a large extent. It's driven by what people are interested in. And that's why the BBC is such a departure from the history of journalism. It's very difficult to locate it, actually, in the kind of, as being some way in a line of descent from newspapers, because its whole purpose is totally different. It's precisely there to reflect all positions equally. And this final word, it hasn't been doing that. You can see that because you now have a BBC verified correspondent. What a ludicrous concept, a verified. I mean, all BBC stuff should be verifiable. I mean, otherwise it should never have been transmitted in the first place. Okay, yeah, I'll shut up.
I actually agree with all of that. That was brilliantly put. We were all sort of agreeing that this point about what is and isn't reported is incredibly important. And actually, when you're on a news desk, it's really hard. The example I used this morning was if there's a flood in Indonesia, and 1,000 people die, or there's a major report published on gender inequality, they're two completely different issues, but which one do you put as your lead story on the website? You only have one lead story, and which one you choose says something about the way you view the world. It says something about what you value, it says something about what you fear. And I think that that is inescapable, and it's an incredibly hard choice for journalists to make, and it's one they have to make every day. But as a professional journalist has just told you, 90% of the time, they follow the reader. They know what the reader wants. They see the data. They see the sales numbers. And that's an honest way of earning a living and an honest way of presenting news. And I think where the mistrust comes in is when people see the BBC and they feel like they're forcing stories up the agenda that they're not interested in, but they think that the BBC thinks they should be interested in. So it's incredibly hard to choose what you do and you don't include. On the point about Boris Johnson, really quickly, I actually disagreed with some of the politicians that they hired. Lawrence Fox seemed like someone you could interview, but do you want to employ him, and then you have to vouch for him? And I think GB News viewers are going to become a bit tired, actually, of listening to politicians. And I think, but the good thing about GB News is that there will be a corrective. People will turn off and get bored of it. I think it's a bit odd that Boris Johnson is becoming a presenter. I think it's odd, but they're free to make that choice.
Thank you. On the boycott question and what stories you decide, you also decide who you have on. And one of the things that really annoys me about the BBC at the moment is they present certain activists with agendas as though they're experts and neutral. And then, for example, the LGB Alliance is not allowed on the BBC. And producers who want them on are told they can't go on. So what's that about? Well, we know what it's about, but I'm just pointing out. LGB Alliance then go on GB News and everyone says they're right-wing. Why would you have them on the BBC? I actually agree with Tina Stahl, though. I really want to believe in the ideal of impartiality. But I just wanted to say that what's annoying is when the BBC act as though they're the only people in the world who are impartial. Anyone who criticises them is considered to be a bit mad. But when you go on it and they interview you, as has happened to me on many an occasion, their presenters drip with contempt. I mean, it's, they just kind of sneer at you. And the thing that they don't understand is that the viewers see that. And so even though they've been impartial by ticking the box by having you on, they've also treated you as though you are the worst human being in the world. And people saw that very clearly, and therefore they no longer believe that they are neutral in the way they treat people, because they aren't.
Thank you. So if we come over here, come over this end. One there.
Thanks. My name's Thomas Mason. I'm a BBC political journalist based in Westminster. Before that, I'm about 4.5 years in the sort of domestic radio newsroom, writing the news on Radio 4 and Radio 2. I would just like to slightly question this idea from Ian that it was kind of fine while he was there, but it's all gone to pot since. Things do move on. There's different initiatives and so forth. We've all had, you say Tim Davie's abandoned the concept of impartiality. I think it's actually, from what we know about him, it's supposed to be his central core mission, actually. We've all had to do impartiality training. Yes, clearly there have been some cock-ups with the likes of Gary Lineker, but as news journalists, we have to stick to being pretty impartial most of the time. You can't be impartial about everything, can you? You can't be impartial about whether the Earth is flat or so forth, or gravity. So maybe it's okay as society moves on and we represent the country not to be impartial about racism, maybe not to be impartial about climate change, although there are issues there. I think Tina makes a very interesting point to say that impartiality doesn't have to be boring. I think GB News is great, wonderful competition for the BBC, clearly a big coup with Boris, but I get quite bored listening to Dan Wootton telling you what he thinks about Harry and Meghan, or Lawrence Fox telling me what he thinks about wokeism. So it's changed the way I think about arguments. I think where Ian is bang on. I think that there is still that culture of trying really hard, regardless of, you're probably right, there probably is a left-wing bias in the views of the people who work there, but I think they do try on a daily basis to try and play things pretty straight. So look elsewhere, look across the Atlantic at the state of broadcast media there. Okay, of course the BBC is not perfect. It's a lazy argument to say you get criticised from both sides, but we do actually genuinely do our best. And people always ask me what the BBC thinks on Palestine, whatever that is the attribution, but overall, I think the individual journalists, work, and there may be newer ones who are more campaigning. But I think generally, it's a pretty conscientious effort. So thanks for my minute.
So, Saida, I do believe there is a space for national broadcast, because irrespective of the fact that there are so many channels and we can pick and choose, a lot of people will pick and choose only the one that resonated with the same idea. So we will carry on with this echo chamber of just thinking the same things and not able to also see other things. So going back to the BBC, yes, I think there is a role there in terms of this impartiality, which is much more relating to this broad ability to present different views, which probably was linked to the past and what BBC was in the past. So why we cannot go back to what the BBC was? Is it possible?
Very quick question. Boris Johnson, biggest liar in British recent political history. George Osborne left the Chancellor and went to the Evening Standard. I hear Jeremy Hunt is soon to be looking for a new job. I wonder if there should be more safeguarding in place for politicians moving into the media. And my second point was disgraceful people like Lawrence Fox. How do you deal with them without making them become a martyr?
Not partly relating to what you've just said about Lawrence Fox. Tina, you said that GB News had, oh God, sorry, my brain doesn't work. You made a criticism of GB News. What was it you said? Some disgraceful, no, I'm so sorry. What was the word you used?
I said with
nasty,
some of the nasty. I said freedom of speech shouldn't excuse nastiness.
Yes, you said that there was either a nasty journalist or nasty things going on at GB News, and I just wondered if you'd say what those nasty things were, because nobody else has made any claim, and I'm not apologist for GB News.
You can't impartially describe Hamas. There's at least 3 words you could use: terrorist, militant, or fighter. Each of those words conveys a different meaning. Words have meanings, and the word you use turns on what particular aspect of Hamas you want to convey to your listenership. The idea that you could, I mean, if you think that, as the BBC does, you're being impartial by describing them as, let's say, fighters, then you are treating them as on a par with the Israeli Defense Force. And that is fundamentally wrong to so many people. The point I'm making is that it's a fiction, this idea of impartiality, unless, as existed in an earlier era, you have a society which has a large degree of consensus where 90% plus of the population can agree on where the centre ground is. That is not our society nowadays. We are riven by conflict and an absence of consensus. Hence, impartiality is a myth, and I'm delighted GB News is here.
Okay, I'm an ex-BBC, son of a BBC journalist, but I'd like to stand up for Ian's point that the decision about how to report climate change was a turning point. I believe that's when people on the Today Show and elsewhere started talking about this thing called false balance. So that was like, if you've got science on one side, or at least a scientific consensus, then, well, there is no other side. But climate change, there's a lot more to that debate than science. But that weirdly narrow way of looking at controversies has expanded from treating science as the only valid side in an argument to treating expertise as the only valid side, hence Emily Maitlis, etc., etc. So have we got to the point where journalists' intellectual grasp of these things is so poor?
Thank you very much. So we're quickly running out of time. So Helen, if you could give us a minute, and then Liam, you'll be next.
Yeah, so I think that I don't understand why Ofcom regulates any news channel except maybe the BBC in terms of impartiality. And I think the BBC should monitor its own impartiality. And if it doesn't do a good job, it should just end. I don't think there should be a regulator doing this, which is one thing I wanted to say. I think the other thing on whether you call some Hamas terrorists, I mean, I could agree with your point of view. I just don't think that's the job of the journalists. There's always colour people, there's going to be people who are giving opinions, there's going to be all sorts of things, but I don't think it is a job of the journalist to attribute an adjective to an organisation. I think that's something that you have to get from somewhere else. So I do think that it is possible to have good down the line journalism and separate that from opinion. And I think that would make for a very interesting, lively media like you have in America. I think the media in America is pretty fabulous.
Thank you. If you hold your applause, Sylvia and Liam.
I really want to thank the guy from the BBC who stood up and defended BBC, because I agree with you largely, actually. I do think there are loads of fine journalists at the BBC trying bloody hard to be impartial, and they're doing it in an impossible set of circumstances. They quite often, one of the BBC defences, they say, yes, but people on the left and the right are pissed off with us, so we must be doing something right. And I think, well, you're clearly doing lots wrong as well. I really think you operate under an impossible set of circumstances and increasingly difficult. Yeah, I do think the BBC do a good job, but I think they would be better served if your great presenters like Emily and stuff could be honest about their opinions. I think people would trust them and listen to them more. The point about Ofcom is really important. This ruling in 2014 about climate change actually came with an accompanying Ofcom investigation, and Ofcom also ruled that you could be completely one-sided on that. And I think this is something, maybe this is something for next year. We have to remember that Ofcom are about to expand their remit across the entire internet, thanks to the online safety bill. Slightly different, they'll be looking out for safety, not impartiality, but that's interesting, and should they be regulated in the way? The Boris thing, I just want to remind everyone, I was part of the campaign to bring him down. I ended up working with Tom Tugendhat. I'm not here to defend Boris. But, I just wanted to point that out. And I just wanted to say I've spent a long time slagging off the BBC and everyone. But there is some great journalists there doing great work under difficult circumstances. I just think they could make it easier.
Thank you, Liam. Tina.
Okay, I guess just to pick up where Liam's left off, I think the BBC needs to be clearer about what it stands for and why it's an essential part of the future in this world full of choice. And I think if it can do that and show how what it stands for is driving all of its decisions, both institutionally and editorially, we will get something which feels so much more satisfying. To a couple of the other points, to the lady's question about what I was referring to, I am, as I said before, I'm very pro the arrival of GB News. I'm not in any way opposing it whatsoever. I was just trying to make the point. The example I was really alluding to was the exchange between Dan Wootton and Lawrence Fox about that particular journalist. They've both been suspended now, so that's a good thing as far as I'm concerned. I agree that the BBC should have used the word terrorism at least on the weekend of 7th of October to describe what had happened. I think its failure to do so was bad news. And as to the person's point who is a journalist at BBC News, it is true that Tim Davie has made impartiality his top priority. I think that's a good thing, but I think that both that editorial decision that I've just referred to and the social media guidelines that have been released as a result of the Gary Lineker undermines his commitment to making impartiality his top priority.
Thank you. Ian, just hold your applause, please, Ian. No, not that I didn't think that was brilliant, but do it all at the end.
And I don't think everything was fine back in my day by any means, but I think things have changed. I think they demonstrably have changed. I don't think sports reporters in the past would have been able to come out and say that the Home Secretary is essentially a Nazi. That just would not have happened before, and I think that has been a crucial moment for the BBC, and I think Tim Davie has lost the plot here. They may still observe the rules of impartiality to a certain extent, but look what he's done. He says that people who are employed by the BBC in whatever capacity are now allowed to express opinions, political opinions, as long as they don't campaign. So that means, that's a fundamental change, because, you can express all sorts of opinions, but we know which opinions will be expressed and allowed to be expressed in the BBC. And as I said before, you won't get, someone like Graham Linehan being acceptable as somebody acceptable for the BBC. So I think things have changed, and I think Tim Davie has underlined that, and the extent to which there are issues which are no longer seen as debatable has been a regrettable change in the way in which the BBC has interpreted impartiality.
All right, thank you very much to all of my speakers. It was a really brilliant panel. Thank you to you for your questions.